I started backpacking around Australia about a year ago, and it's honestly been one of the best experiences of my life. I've done some really cool things, and I've met some extraordinary people. But I've also seen a few things I can't explain. After spending time in backpackers around Sydney, and then working my way up the East Coast, I've come to realise that backpackers have a tendency to witness weird shit, especially here in Oz. There's a sort of backpacking culture. It takes a certain type of person to enjoy spending the majority of your time travelling to out-of-the-way places, living in hostels or vans, and hitching rides long distances with complete strangers. Because of that, those people get along pretty well with each other. So, I spend a lot of my time trading stories over drinks at the beach or during road trips. Some of them are fantastic, weird, and some of them just plain scary. I always take these stories with a grain of salt because a lot of these people, they like to exaggerate, or they're just straight up full of it. But every once in a while, you get someone who you can just tell has really seen something. A good example of this is a story I heard from a guy named Ethan, who I met up in Cairns, which is on the northeastern corner of the country, wedged between the Daintree rainforest and the Great Barrier Reef. The city itself, it's absolutely beautiful, and combined with everything there is to see and do around it, Cairns is one of the best places I've visited. However, there apparently was a bit of a dark side. Ethan is from Wales, in his mid-20s, and he came to Australia to see the sights and just have some fun. When he got to Cairns, he'd already been in the country for about 10 months and was reaching the end of his trip. He planned to work in the city for about a month, see and do all he could, and then fly home. One of the first things he wanted to do when he got there was see the rainforest, which is renowned for its waterfalls and swimming holes, as well as the wildlife that you wouldn't be able to see anywhere else in the world. I'm talking pythons, cassowaries, koalas, gorgeous butterflies, even tree kangaroos. But as I was opening up a couple of beers when Ethan was telling me this, his eyes darkened, and he began to tell me about one of the rainforest's more sinister denizens. A friend of his had recommended a tour. It was essentially just a guy who took a couple of people around the tablelands in a jeep, showing them some of the cool popular spots, as well as some lesser-known areas. At first, everything went well. The group Ethan was in, they were all pretty nice and consisted of another backpacker from Denmark, an older couple from the US who were on vacation, and the tour guide, a big, very Australian guy named Riley. They went and swam at some of the more popular creeks and saw a few spectacular waterfalls. His favourite being the mildly famous Milla Milla Falls. Then they went and settled back in the jeep as Riley asked the group what they wanted to do for the last thing of the day. Ethan immediately spoke up, and he asked if he knew any good places to see some of the rainforest's massive curtain trees. Apparently, Ethan has always had a thing for trees, and he had heard that the curtain figs in northern Queensland were a sight to see. Riley nodded, and he said that they could go to one of the tourist spots to see one of the trees where the government had set up a viewing platform. Or, if the group was okay with a bit of a hike, he could bring them deeper into the forest, show them a fantastic grove he knew of, pretty far off the beaten path. Everyone seemed amiable to the hiking idea to see the better trees, so they set off and drove for a while, until the guide suddenly pulled off the side of the road and began to lead them up what looked like an old game trail. The trail took them uphill through dense jungle, and it was a lot tougher than anyone expected. After a while, The older couple fell behind, and then so did the Danish guy, until it was just Riley and Ethan, who was just very committed to seeing these trees. At this point, Ethan grew more hesitant, and I had to egg him on a little to continue his story. So, they left the others at a nice little creek and continued on for another good 20 minutes of rough terrain. Then, they finally reached the grove of curtain fig trees. I've seen trees of the same type, specifically the one all the tour buses stop off to look at. They really are something special. But Ethan insists that this grove far off the beaten path made the ones I've seen look like knee-high weeds. At first, he was really glad that he made the hike, because it truly was a spectacle. But after a few minutes, he noticed that the jungle was completely silent, except for Riley's explanation of how the curtain fig trees formed. Eventually, Riley noticed it too and commented on the eerie feeling it gave him. Ethan agreed, saying that it felt like they were being watched. The guide told him to stay put while he took a quick look around the other side of the tree grove, and Ethan agreed, although not quite happy to be left alone. Riley was gone for about a minute before Ethan began to smell something vile, like musk mixed with rotting fish, which added to his unease. Right when Ethan was about to go looking for Riley, he heard a loud crash, almost deafening in the silence, like something fell out of the canopy from a great height. He ran towards the noise, and as he rounded the corner, he was tackled hard to the ground. Surprised, Ethan went to yell out, but felt someone put their hand over his mouth, and he recognized it to be Riley, who whispered in an insistent but panicked tone, "Play dead, play dead, play dead." Not knowing what was going on, Ethan obeyed and lay still in the mud as rustling marked the approach of something large. He didn't have a very good angle to exactly see what it was, and he was afraid to move, but he assured me that it was unlike anything he'd ever seen before. The smell alone, it was enough to make his eyes water, but he was able to glimpse the vague shape of a squat creature, about 5 feet tall, covered in red skin or fur. It crept its way towards the two men, and as it grew closer, Ethan could make out its short limbs as it crawled on all fours. When the beast was within a few feet of him, he saw that each leg ended in impossibly long, spindly fingers. Ethan grinned ruefully at me, and he said that he almost pissed himself when the monster bent down to sniff him, giving him a view of its mouth, which was almost 3 feet long itself, and it didn't seem to close all the way, showing off a row of toothless, rotting gums. The creature then stood still, seemingly watching them as they laid there still for several minutes, or what seemed to be hours. Suddenly, it got up, and Ethan said that he thinks he heard it jump up and climb into one of the nearby trees. They continued to lay there for a while longer, until it was full-on dusk, and Riley began to get up, saying that they were probably safe now. On the hike back to the rest of the group, Ethan tried to talk about the monster to Riley, and he asked how he knew how to play dead. But he was reluctant to talk about it, and only answered that it was a guess, based on an old story his grandpa told him. When they rejoined the group and hit the road back to the city, Ethan was too freaked out to really talk about it, and Riley didn't mention anything either. In fact, Ethan had not told anyone about it until me, when I arrived in Cairns a few weeks later. I'm not sure what he really saw, but I was very careful to stay on the main trails when I did my tour of the rainforest. I didn't see anything myself, but I don't think I'll ever forget the story. Okay, so I've been up all around the Down Under, from Cairns to Perth, from the Gold Coast to the Rock. But the longest I've stayed anywhere here was in good old Sydney. Big cities, they always have plenty to see. And while I wouldn't recommend staying there for a long time if you're a backpacker, Sydney is a gorgeous city. I couldn't even count the number of people from all over the world that I've met who agree that there's nothing quite like seeing the Sydney Harbour Bridge from the shadow of the Opera House. There's something there for everyone. Luna Park and ferry rides for families, great nightclubs and pubs for partying, museums, beaches, tours, you name it. Also, if you're into the darker side of things, there are heaps of urban legends and bizarre things happening in the city. I've heard all kinds of stories of weird shit going down. A good friend of mine I met at work, he swears he saw ghost lights, like giant fireflies, circling the supports under the Sydney Harbour Bridge late at night. When he went to look up if anyone else had seen something similar, he found reports of people dying during the construction of the bridge and being buried in the pillars. Later on, a flatmate told me of an unsettling legend where sometimes a man wearing a mask with huge horns would show up at the harbour or the city central hours before tragedy struck. He's been sighted before fires, train wrecks, and car accidents, and he's mostly known as the Devil-Horned Man. Along with him, and an unbelievable amount of supposedly haunted roads, Sydney and its sprawling suburbs are as good a place as any if you're trying to catch a glimpse of something supernatural. My only real, unexplainable experience in Sydney was actually in the Blue Mountains, which is about an hour-and-a-half train ride from Sydney Central. At the time, I was living in a flat there and working in the city, so I had about a 20-minute walk through a scarcely populated neighbourhood to the train station, and then a long ride to the city centre. I didn't really mind the long commute because I could read, write, or whatever on the train. But sometimes, when I would get back late at night and have to walk home, that could be a little freaky. The thing is that the Blue Mountain area is very much surrounded by kind of jungly forests that, at the time, I was not used to at all. The natural landscape is seriously beautiful, but relatively foreign for me. So when I had to first take a walking path that led me away from the road and a little more into the bush, I was more than a bit nervous. Turns out, I had a pretty good reason to be. I was at that place about a month before I saw anything, and at first, I didn't see anything. I just would get a bit of a weird feeling when I was walking home at night. The path I took home, it went along a residential street for a while, curved into the woods, and then back onto the road. Where the path went into the woods, there were absolutely no lights, so I took to bringing a little flashlight with me on the days where I knew I wouldn't get home before dark. Usually, I was perfectly fine up until the sidewalk turned into a dirt path and curved into the bush. When that happened, I would get this feeling I can't really explain. It was the feeling of being watched, but almost tangible, like whatever was watching me just wanted me to know it. Most of the time, I could just wave this feeling off. I mean, it was a pretty well-used path that people walked all the time, although only really during the day. After a few weeks of just general unease, during one of my nighttime walks home, I decided I was just a little afraid of the dark, and there really wasn't anything to worry about. Pretty much seconds after I came to believe that, I caught a bit of movement off of my peripheral vision. My newfound confidence vanished. I quickly turned around and shone my flashlight in the direction of the movement. I scanned the brush in a panic, but couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. The woods in the Blue Mountains are filled with lots of small animals, possums, quolls, all kinds of lizards, and even kangaroos. But I thought that I'd seen something quite a bit bigger than any of those. Then, I went back to thinking that I probably just imagined it, and continued, albeit a little quicker, on my way. When I reached the end of the forest path, thankful for the light of the street lamps that covered this end of the road, I turned back to look the way I came. Peering into the dark bush, I got that feeling of being watched, worse than I ever had before. Whatever I was trying to see was looking back at me, and for a moment, I thought I got a glimpse of the light reflecting off of something, maybe eyes. At this point, I was hesitant to keep walking that path at night and started trying to walk on the side of the road instead. The reason I hadn't been walking on the road in the first place is that it makes for a bit of a longer walk, and I always get worried about getting hit by someone taking the small hills that make up most of the streets around these parts. Whilst walking on the road made me feel a lot less isolated late at night, it was still right up against the bush, and I just couldn't shake that feeling. Not knowing what was out there was the thing that really bothered me, and so I mentioned my experiences to my landlord, Michael, who has lived in the Blue Mountains area going on 20 years. Michael is a pretty open-minded guy. He listened to me intently. After I was done, he nodded and grinned, and he said, "Ah, sounds like you've been having a run-in with the panther, mate." I gave him a bit of a surprised look and asked him what the hell the panther was. He explained to me that the Blue Mountains area has always had a bit of an urban legend about a big cat that roams around the woods at night. Confused, I asked him if it was dangerous. Michael laughed and slapped me on the back. "I don't think you got anything to worry about, Sunshine. Even if it is real, it's been around so long. I doubt it's an actual animal. Far as I know, there's nothing flesh and blood in the bush that can hurt you, except maybe the snakes." Unsurprisingly, I was not particularly reassured by that chat, but I didn't have much choice but to make that walk. My job needed me to work nights, and I couldn't afford a car or to take a taxi every day. And so, I resigned myself to having to deal with it and hoped that I was just a bit bonkers. I did everything I could to only walk through the woods during the day, but more often than not, I still had to walk along the woods most nights. I almost always felt uneasy at that same stretch of wood and would occasionally see, or maybe trick myself into seeing, something walking deep in the forest beside me. However, it was about another 2 months until I saw what essentially chased me out of the Blue Mountains. It was a regular night. I'd just worked an 11-hour shift and had slept the train ride home. So, I was walking home really drowsy. I was super tired and it was a long time since I'd seen anything in the bush, so I decided to take the shorter walk through the woods. I had my flashlight with me, and at first, everything seemed alright By then, I was used to that weird feeling during that stretch of forest, and I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary until I heard a noise out to my right, where there was nothing but woods for miles. It sounded like a soft purr that slowly got louder and then suddenly stopped. Startled, I turned towards the noise and shone my flashlight in the direction it came from. I didn't see anything at first, but after a few seconds, I saw some movement about 10 yards away from me. I caught it with my flashlight. A huge pair of big, yellow eyes. At that moment, it began to move slowly towards me, and me, not being particularly courageous, began to book it down that path in the direction of my house. As I started to run, so did it, matching my pace and gaining on me. Noticeable only by the soft shifting of brush and branches. It was unnaturally fast, and I knew that if I stayed on the path, it would get me. So, I did my best to barrel through the woods in the direction of the road. The ground underneath me, it was rocky and uneven, and the trees posed a difficult obstacle. But I was somehow able to weave around it, using my flashlight as a guide. However, whatever it was, it continued to gain until I could sense it only feet behind me. I thought I was a goner, but right as I heard it closing in, I felt the ground fall out from under me as I tumbled onto and across the road. Suddenly, the slope I was sitting on filled with light as a car rounded the hill at the exact moment as something burst from the woods. It was huge, and while it was vaguely feline-like, it definitely was not a panther. Whatever it was, it seemed to be made out of living shadow with the eyes of yellow fire. It uttered a soul-wrenching yowl as the car, unable to slow down, hit it full on. The driver stopped his car with the screech of burning tires, and he got out to check on me and whatever it was that he hit. I was scratched up, but fine. And when we went to check on the creature, we were amazed to find that nothing was there. No damage on his car either. No evidence of this thing's existence at all. The owner of the car offered me a ride home, not sure what to believe himself. I thanked him, and over the next couple of days, I arranged to move back to the city and haven't been back to the Blue Mountains since. I'm not sure exactly what it was I saw, but I know that it's definitely not a part of my trip I will ever forget. I definitely believe that pretty much no matter where you go, you can always run into weird shit, whether you want to or not.